Why did Aaron Glenn choose the New York Jets over the New Orleans Saints, ladies and gentlemen? So there are some hot rumors in the streets right now regarding the New Orleans Saints, specifically regarding Aaron Glenn and Mickey Loomis. So Tim Jones put out a tweet that absolutely lit the Twittersphere on fire. This got like 500,000 impressions. I mean, this being retweeted all over the place. And it claims that, per a source or an unidentified source, that Aaron Glenn basically, his number one choice was to go to the Saints. But he asked, hey, what do y'all think about moving on from Mickey Loomis? To, I assume, Mickey Loomis. And Mickey Loomis said, yeah, I don't know about that, champ. I'm kind of thinking that's not going to be a thing. And then, allegedly, that's what pushed Glenn to the Jets. So we're going to talk about that. I wasn't going to do a video on this, but I did have some commenters reach out and say, James, you were a former Big J journalist, former crime reporter for a Pulitzer Prize-winning newspaper. You were a former, tried and true reporter, trained. Give us your take. And so I said, okay, fine, you're right. I was, interviewed Robin Roberts twice. Nancy Pelosi drove Sinbad to the airport. Not a big deal. So we're going to watch it, react to it. I'm going to talk about it from every angle, from the journalist angle, from the Saints angle, from the Aaron Glenn angle. We got it all. Okay, more angles than a protractor. Okay, let's go ahead and get into it.
This is an interactive podcast. I've been doing this since 2018 and take a lot of pride in this podcast. And I take a lot of pride in my work. And I want people to know in advance, me personally, I'm not one of those individuals that tries to do things for shock value. I'm not the type of person that will just basically just trying to get your attention and just want you to gravitate to me like that. I've been blessed and privileged to be able to meet some very well-respected individuals in the world of sports, in the NFL world. And from time to time, they'll give me some information that I can pass along. And, what I'm about to say, I wholeheartedly 100% trust the individual that told me this. This is the same individual that told me a few years ago when people thought I was crazy, when I was talking about Sean Payton stepping down before he even had his press conference. He told me that he was going to step down. He was the same person that told me last year about Chase Young and how the Saints were able to sign him and how he had to get neck surgery. And then lo and behold, the very next day, that's when the story started to come out. So I 100% trust this individual. And the story that I'm going to tell you is about now recently hired head coach Aaron Glenn. Now, I'm pretty sure a lot of you already saw the stories that were coming out about Aaron Glenn a few weeks ago, right? Aaron Glenn and everybody was saying that the Jets were his prime destination. That's the spot that he wanted to go to. That was the dream spot. And the story they kind of ran with it. But what I found out was that the Jets were indeed not his number one spot. In fact, this number one spot was the New Orleans Saints. Yeah.
So let's talk about the actual report and the reporting of it, the source or whatever. I mean, in today's day and age, I don't have a problem with someone, reporting something that they hear from a trusted source. But what I will say is you take an enormous risk, a huge risk, if the source is not like a one-to-one source. If the source is not, like, I don't know, you know the game Telephone, where someone says something, and they pass it to the next person, they pass it to the next person, they pass it to the next person. There's only a few people who would know if this is true. And it's Aaron Glenn, basically anyone on that Zoom call where Aaron Glenn reportedly made this claim. So unless it is one of them, you're starting to kind of dilute, you're starting to get kind of further down that telephone game. And that's where things can get a little tricky. And, you got to put a lot of faith in who is telling you this. And you also have to put a lot of care into how you're communicating it. For example, do I think Aaron Glenn got on that Zoom call and said to Mickey Loomis and whoever else was on the call, hey, by the way, I sure wouldn't mind naming the GM to Mickey Loomis. And like it just seems kind of weird, right? Like it seems kind of weird that he would, one, say that on this like introductory Zoom call the week he's trying to prepare for the playoff game. Like it seems like a weird thing to happen. It also seems insane that the Saints would entertain that. Like, why would they entertain that? In what world does Aaron Glenn, without even getting through the interview process, like just the introductory call, in what universe would any team be like, oh, yeah, no, that's cool. Yeah, for sure. Like, Aaron Glenn he doesn't have he hasn't got that kind of clout to make that request. That is nuts. To basically, and a lot of people are saying, well, Jacksonville just kind of had the same situation with Liam Cohen and Trent Baalke. Baalke's only been there for like 4 years, okay? And Baalke's had some real whoopsie-poopsies with, some of the drafts and the Trevor Lawrence contract, and he's like, whatever he is, 20 games under 500. So that's very different than Mickey Loomis, who has been there for the better part of 20 years, right? So it's one thing to be like, hey, I know the guy who is in the will. I know the guy who is basically an owner. I know the guy who's been there for 20-something years, but hey, I know since we were talking for 30 minutes here on Microsoft Teams, you mind telling that guy to hit the road so I can come in there and pick my GM? Seems like an insane request. Now, what seems much more likely is Glenn may have wanted to or talked about or hinted at wanting to bring in his boy, Lance Newmark. Now, Lance was linked to being a GM pairing with Ben Johnson and Aaron Glenn. They worked with the Lions for like 20-something years. He has been a known connection with both of those candidates, as if they get a job, more than likely they'll want to bring him in as the GM. Word on the street was that was Ben Johnson's whole thing, that Ben Johnson wanted to name his GM. It would have been him. He interviewed with Jacksonville. We assume that's what happened, if he actually wanted to take the Jacksonville job or if he wanted to take the Bears job, whatever. But so when you look at Glenn, it's like, okay, maybe he did bring that up. Maybe he brought up like, well, I would like to get Lance in there, and then potentially Lance could help out with the roster and help out with this. And maybe that was the conversation. That sounds much more likely. That sounds much more likely that he wanted to position or float the idea of Lance getting involved in the front office. And maybe that was shot down. But that is very different than he has an individual problem with Mickey Loomis, right? So just that tiny wrinkle of a difference in the communication changes the entire story. Because now the story is Aaron Glenn hates Mickey Loomis. Aaron Glenn wanted Mickey Loomis fired. But is that exactly what was said? I don't know. Now, it also lines up with why Aaron Glenn would go to the Jets. The Jets don't have a GM. So it seems like, well, maybe the Jets, that's a perfect landing spot for him because he can name his GM. He can bring his boy, Lance, in, right? So that makes sense. That lines up of why he would want to work for the Jets or be the head coach of the Jets. Now, it is interesting that the Jets have not, as of this video, have not done that. They according to them, their GM search is still wide open.
Yes, that is what was told to me. His number one spot was the New Orleans Saints. He wanted to be the coach of the New Orleans Saints. Had no issue with the roster. Had no issues with the cap. None of that stuff, right?
Well, hold on. If you have no issues with the cap, if you have no issues with the roster, then what's your issue with the GM? Why would you want to replace the GM if you have no issue with the cap and the roster? You just don't like him as a person? You just not a fan of him as an individual? Don't want to talk to him? Don't want to eat lunch with him? Don't want to eat dinner with him? I mean, it seems like that would be the number one and number two problems you would have with the GM is the salary cap situation and the roster. But if you're like, nah, man, love the roster, love the salary cap, hate the GM, it seems like kind of again, like that. It seems like much more of a. It just seems kind of weird, right?
Saints had a conversation with him. Aaron Glenn had one thing in mind that he wanted to do, right? Aaron Glenn wanted his own general manager. He wanted to be a part of the process where the Saints would elect a new general manager. Had no issues with Mickey Loomis at all. He just preferred that Mickey Loomis maybe serve in a more of a executive role, right?
See, like this is sounding, see how different this is? Like, see how, as you kind of look at different ways of being communicated, like right there, Aaron Glenn has no issue with Mickey Loomis. Aaron Glenn does not want to fire Mickey Loomis. Aaron Glenn does not want Mickey Loomis out of the building. He just wants Mickey Loomis in an executive role to bring in his own guy and to have more of a like working with that guy for the roster and whatnot. That's a completely different narrative than Aaron Glenn wants Mickey Loomis out of the building. Aaron Glenn would love to be with the Saints, but Mickey Loomis, totally different. Totally different, which again is why you got to be really careful with how things are reported, because they do kind of take on their own narratives, and they do, like, how many people, you can go in the tweet right now, how many people in the reply take it as Aaron Glenn wants Mickey Loomis to be fired? I would assume most, right? But then that is, he has no problem with Mickey Loomis. He wants him to remain in the building. He wants him to stay in the front office. He wants him to stay on the staff. Well, that's two very different situations.
And he wanted to work with the New Orleans Saints in bringing in a new general manager. Like I said, he had no issues with Mickey Loomis or anything like that. He just knew, like, kind of, I guess, how Mickey operated. And, of course, the New Orleans Saints wasn't willing to oblige with their request. So.
Also, we'll say good. Like, that's insane. I wouldn't want to oblige with that request either. There's no way I would say, yeah, let's just completely flip the entire franchise. Let's bring in a new coach. Let's bring in, at that point, you're just the New Orleans Aaron Glenn's. You might as well just change the name. Like, think about what's happening. If you oblige to do that, you hire Aaron Glenn as your head coach. He names the new defensive staff, the new offensive staff. You replace your GM with his pick. Damn, is he going to pick the uniform colors? Like, what's going on here?
That was the big issue. So instead, he decided to go, to the Jets. So a lot of people are probably wondering to themselves, like, why didn't the New Orleans Saints even get a chance or an opportunity at, maybe, counteracting what the Jets had to offer Aaron Glenn? That was the issue. Now, the source was not sure when that transpired. He doesn't know if he talked to the Jets and, he called the Saints, after he left the building, letting them know what, he was going to do. And then finally he decided it, or this was something during the time where they did a virtual interview with him. That was one of his requests.
I'll tell you this, again, I'm not knocking the source, but if the source doesn't know, if the source is reporting on a conversation that is this intense, but doesn't know when the conversation took place, that's I don't know if that holds up in a court of law. As far as Glenn leaving the building and all that stuff, I think Glenn, when he interviewed with the Jets, I think when he went there, they had a decision made there. The fact that he literally left the building and then signed the contract Wednesday morning, I don't think he left the building and was unsure of what he would do. I don't think he left the building and started calling front offices and was like, all right, let me leave the interview, went back to the hotel, called Mickey Loomis from the hotel and was like, hey, man, I just left the Jets thing. I got a couple hours here before I go to sleep. You wouldn't mind quitting, would you? I don't think that happened. I think he went to the Jets interview, knew exactly what was going to happen, physically left the building, went back, and then just went back to sign the papers. It might have been one of those things where they all come to an agreement there, but then it's like, well, let's just do this tomorrow morning. Let's not, that sounds totally plausible. So I would assume this conversation happened around the virtual interview.
So all in all, the reason why the Saints don't have Aaron Glenn as of right now, because the Saints weren't willing to allow him to appoint his own general manager. And that's understandable, folks, because if you look at the Jaguars. The Jaguars, who were very committed to Trent Baalke, the general manager of the Jaguars, they end up just firing him, right? Letting him go because it's probably because that was one of the coaches that they're very high on. That was probably their request to be able to work with the team to bring in another general manager. So
Baalke had a very like tumultuous kind of career, even in San Francisco. Like he was the big reason why Jim Harbaugh was left, and he was fired from there. And like Baalke is very different than Loomis. Like Loomis is, not to mention Shad Khan and Baalke were kind of like, I think Khan recently was like, I'll fire him if I have a good reason to. Like I don't think there was any kind of, I don't think it was anything like Benson's relationship or Gail Benson's relationship with Mickey Loomis. So the writing was kind of on the wall for Trent Baalke. Again, you're talking about Trayvon Walker draft pick over, like taking him first overall. Again, Trevor Lawrence going first overall, getting the $300 million contract. You're sitting whatever he is, 20 games under 500. Like there's a lot happening there. There's a lot taking place to get fired. And then after whiffing on Ben Johnson and Liam Cohen and whoever else, and if they wanted to name GMs, then now I will say it seems like a really weird timing. Like you've already lost out on Ben Johnson. So is this a ploy? Is this a way to say, all right, look, Liam, we did this for you. Please, please, please be the head coach. Like maybe it's just an all-out Hail Mary decision to go get Liam Cohen. But again, if it was my franchise, if I was a Jaguars fan, I would not want the team to be so all in on a guy that you don't even know how it's going to go. You have no clue how Aaron Glenn's going to be as a head coach. You have no clue how Liam Cohen's going to be as a head coach, or even Ben Johnson. All right, so to be like, we'll just completely turn the franchise upside down for you. I wouldn't want my franchise to do that. I would not want the Saints to do this for Aaron Glenn. I would not want them to do this for Liam Cohen or even Ben Johnson. Like I think it's a crazy request unless you don't have a GM like the Jets. If you're the Jets and you don't have a GM and Aaron Glenn's like, hey, I got my guy, I would like, okay, whatever. Like at that point, it's like no harm, no foul. Like there's no risk. But to fire your guy, like that's a huge risk. Because then if you get, you talk about set your franchise back quite a bit, you can whiff on a coach, and then whiffing on a coach and a GM and a defensive staff and an offensive staff, like that's how you really sink a franchise.
So there you have it, folks. That's the reason why Aaron Glenn is not in New Orleans. What was told to me. All right. And like I said, I trust this individual wholeheartedly, 100%. Like there's not a doubt. Like I don't feel like this is hyperbole. I don't feel like this is something that would just say it. Like every single time this individual has told me something, lo and behold, it comes to be factual. It's rather an insider comes out the very next.
And again, like it could be true, but what is true? Because it sounds like what is not true, what a lot of people are running with, is that Aaron Glenn wanted Mickey Loomis fired. That sounds like it was not the case. It sounds like he just wanted to shift some roles around and bring in his guy, which is a very, very different story, right? It's a very different talking point. So is the actual report that Aaron Glenn wanted to have a position in the front office for his guy Lance? Is that the story? Because I don't think that's not crazy to believe. And that's a much less contentious conversation to have with Mickey Loomis in the front office. Of like, hey, what do y'all think about me bringing on this guy as like in this role? And then they would probably say like, no, we're totally fine with our staff, and we don't want to add to the front office. That is super different than, hey, Mickey, why don't you go ahead and put an egg in your shoe, my man, and beat it, right? So
next day it says it, or like it down the line it ends up becoming true. And like I said, I'm not one of those inside people. I don't even want to play that game. I'm just blessed and privileged at times where people, will hit me up and provide some information. But that was what was told to me. Aaron Glenn wanted to come to New Orleans, and the Saints did not want to move on from Mickey Loomis as the general manager. He wanted to appoint his own. So therefore, there you have it. That's the reason why he's not here. And now the New Orleans Saints have to turn the page to try to figure out who the next guy is going to be. So, there's a few people that they still have in mind, I'm sure. We heard about Mike Kafka and Anthony Weaver coming to New Orleans. They were supposed to fly in, but of course you have some inclement weather out there that kind of stalled that process. You still got Joe Brady out there still coaching for the Buffalo Bills. They're going to be playing in the AFC Championship game. And, Cliff Kingsbury, someone that decided that he doesn't want to.
What I would say to kind of wrap this up is that what I think we can all agree is not true, or is not the case. I don't want to say not true, because it's not like they're saying this. I'm not saying that like Tim's being, he's not incorrect. I'm just saying, like, what this narrative that's out there that coaches are not coming here because of Mickey Loomis, that is incorrect. Like Tim said, this had nothing to do with Loomis. Aaron Glenn had no issue with the salary cap. This is him saying this. Aaron Glenn had no issue with the salary cap. Aaron Glenn had no issue with the roster. And Aaron Glenn had no issue with Mickey Loomis. Okay? So, this is 20 minutes into the video, so I know the comment section is already filled up. How many comments in this video are saying that it's because of Loomis, it's because of the salary cap, or it's because of the roster? Because now we have very conflicting narratives, right? You got a lot. The original story makes it sound like it's a roster issue, it's a salary cap issue, it's a Loomis issue, it's a GM issue. But now, 9 minutes into this explainer, all those have been debunked. So it sounds more of an Aaron Glenn wants to bring his boy in. More of that than there's something wrong with the Saints front office. So a little interesting wrinkle there, So it's risky business. I'll say that it is risky business to push out, things like this from sources, because this is just like in general from just how Twitter works, because the source is anonymous. The source is protected, but the person who tweets is not protected. So this is one of those things where I hope it's right. Like, I hope the source is correct. And if it was me, I'd probably, maybe it's too late now, but you might want to go back and kind of add some more, like, these details. These are very important details. These are very, very important details that without these details, without this context, it makes it sound like it was a fire Mickey Loomis thing. Which in this video, Tim mentions that was never, ever the request. The request was just to shift responsibility around a little bit, keep Loomis in the building. And, so this is, like I said, for a reporter or a journalist or whatever, this is very dicey. This is a very tumultuous, road to go on, especially in social media where things can spread like wildfire. And I remember when I worked at the paper, like, if we got something wrong, very rarely, we would have to issue corrections. We would have to rewrite the story, publish a correction, which is very embarrassing. Like, to do that, very embarrassing. But on social media, that doesn't really happen, right? Like, it's so fast, everything gets picked up and pushed out and new and updated, and everything's so fluid, everything's so fast, where there is no corrections, And if you do issue a correction, it's almost like, like damned if you do, damned if you don't. So we'll see how this plays out. But I think we did get some clarification. I feel much more, because when I first saw this come out, I was like, man, I don't know. That seems like a stretch. Like, you're going to go on the Zoom call and ask to fire the GM. But now after listening to this, it's like, well, that absolutely did not happen. There was absolutely no talk about firing Mickey Loomis. There was absolutely no talk about that. It was just talk about bringing in your guy to the front office and having him have a role, which, yeah, certainly believable from what we know about Glenn's relationship with Lance. So, I don't know. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll end it right there. Let's see a little more.
Take any interviews until the Commanders finish this playoff run, and then Darren Rizzi, who's the only coach that they had that actually had a in-person interview. So those are your candidates right there. And it's unfortunate that you lose out on on Aaron Glenn because of that situation. But I can completely understand that wholeheartedly. And we knew that the New Orleans Saints weren't trying to move on from Mickey Loomis in the first place. So it just seemed like it was just one of those things where they just something that was just not going to happen. We know what Mickey Loomis means to the Saints organization. We know that he wants to keep that front office intact. So it's going to be a hard. I mean, I don't want to say it's going to be a hard sell, but a coach is going to have to come in, understanding that he's going to have to work alongside Mickey Loomis and to try to make this thing go. Which I'm just wondering to myself, which coach is that going to be? I forgot about Kellen Moore too. Kellen Moore.
I mean, there's a lot of coaches. Like, that's another thing too. Like, a lot of people are like, no one wants to come to the Saints. Well, trust me, the Saints will have a head coach next year. Like, think about the Lions when they had a winless season. Guess what happened next year? They got a new coach. The Browns, winless season, complete disaster. Hugh Jackson falls apart. Then Freddie Kitchens is there, and then what happens? They get Kevin Stefanski, young, innovative offensive head coach, 2-time coach of the year. So I know when you zoom in on the Saints, you zoom in on one team, it seems like, you're rock bottom. It seems like it can't get any worse, all that stuff. But can you imagine? Like, think about the Browns. The Browns went 0-16 and brought back their head coach. 0-16 and bring back Hugh Jackson. They say, nah, man, we'll see what you can do. Think about that. Imagine if the Saints would go 0-17 and then they brought back the coaching staff. Oh, my God. That I can't even fathom what the franchise was going through. Like, think about that's truly rock bottom. You go winless, bring back your coach, fire him mid-season the next season, bring back another guy who's an even bigger disaster than Freddie Kitchens. But then a couple years later, you got Kevin Stefanski, you're flying, you're in the playoffs, Baker Mayfield. Like, it's a yo-yo league. There are a lot worse situations than where the Saints are at. So the idea that like no head coach would ever want to be the head coach of the Saints, like Sean Payton, the Saints were 3-13, and the biggest natural disaster in North American history hit the city. The city was underwater, and Sean Payton came here. So it's like the idea that no coach would ever want to come here because it's just there's a lot worse situations out there. So that kind of stuff's where you got to take 50 feet back and look at the entire league. But all right, let me know what you think in the comments. I think this was a very illuminating video. Like I said, I'm glad we reacted to it because I feel like I have a complete grasp on the situation. I feel like I have a complete understanding of what happened, a complete understanding of Glenn's request, what Glenn wanted to do, what the Saints' issue with it was. I mean, I could teach a master's class on this, so I'm glad we did this. Let me know in the comments below what you think. Were you surprised to hear this explanation and to hear that Glenn didn't have a problem with the salary cap, didn't have a problem with the roster, didn't have a problem with Mickey Loomis? And were you surprised to learn that he wanted to keep Mickey Loomis in the building and Mickey Loomis wouldn't have been fired? So let me know. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next